Okay, if it's 7:30.
Yeah, seven.
I'm
Make it at
supposed to be
7:30.
starting the show, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm sharing this. Let me get this over to the slideshow from the beginning.
Wait, okay,
Yeah,
but
Steve
wait.
Steve
do we-
Cavker will send out that.
we can still see each other through the inset.
Yeah,
Okay.
you're along the sidebar.
Right on the side.
See
Okay.
each other. Now, another thing is I won't be able to see any questions. If people post questions in the chat box,
All right.
I need one of you all to read them to me and I'll answer them there or however you want to do it.
Okay.
But I've got enough to work on just going through the slides.
Steve will screen the chat
I'd
box
have to, you know what I'll
questions.
have to do then? I'll have to I'll have to minimize my screen so I can look in the chat box. Otherwise, because
Okay.
if I'm on full screen, I won't be able to see it.
Do a split screen.
I just minimize the screen. That's all.
It's very impressive company. So team.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Well, I guess we'll yield the floor to Sheldon now.
All right.
Okay. I know Frank wants to get into it, but just let me make my opening remarks. Thanks. Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
Yeah. On this slightly improved February evening, where it hasn't been as bitterly cold as it's been in a little while, although we could get another chill coming up. Yeah. I'd like to start off, right away, with a subject that most people might find uncomfortable. Those of you who are watching this Zoom program who haven't paid your dues, the deadline is March 15th.
The Ides of March.
So, be quite, we can, hopefully we'll see your checks or money orders at the post office box in East Rockaway. Because otherwise, without a current membership, it would be hard for Steve Kalka to extend, the link for any future programs.
And the bulletin, don't forget.
Yeah, that's right. That's the best of all. You won't get the
March would be your
bulletin.
last bulletin.
Yeah. For any of our hard copy brethren out there, I have finished the March bulletin. I'm just waiting for the right day to put it. If it's inconvenient tomorrow, it will go out Monday.
Bye.
So it certainly will. I won't take too much of your time. Most of what I have to say, will be in the president's notes, but I do have a very sad duty to perform. Paul and Steve have reminded me that two of our longtime members have recently passed away. John O'Reilly, who was a history teacher at Mount St. Mary's College in Newburgh at 84, and Ken Brownstein, aged 87. Ken was also a program presenter. I think he presented a program, one or two programs for us, and he lived in Manhattan. So at about this time, may I have a moment of silence? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, so if your e-bulletins are recipients, I think Gigi should have sent out the e-bulletins today. And those of you who are hard copy, they're going out, if not tomorrow, definitely Monday. So
Excellent.
there's one thing which, of course, you'll hear again in the read again in the president's notes, but there are now two sets of R211s, which are now riding the rails between St. George and Tottenville.
Mm,
I saw Combine car set 105 to 109 recently. Haven't been on it yet, but I've seen it. So that's the big thing. I can't think of anything earth-shattering locally or internationally, so I'm going to turn the program over to Paul.
thank you, General Foz. Well, I
Mhm.
want to welcome everyone to the February meeting of the Railroad Enthusiasts. And as you'll see, in the guise of Mr. Frank Scheer, once again, proof is in the pudding that month after month, year after year, the NYRRE presents the very best in rail fan entertainment. And this month will obviously be no exception with our program on Norfolk and Western Railway depots. And looking ahead to next month, we will be in the good hands of our fellow RE trustee, Cora Soa, for a trip down to the Sunshine State, which was the National Railway Historical Society September 2023 conference that was held there. And Cora will present the very best of Florida rail fanning. We'll ride the Bright Line to its rail maintenance facility in West Palm Beach and the Bright Line Operations Center in Miami. We'll be aboard the Sugar Express of the U.S. Sugar Corporation, a visit to the Flagler Mansion. And I mean, without Flagler, I don't think to this day there'd be very much in terms of rail in Florida. The former home of the Florida East Coast Railway, and finally a ride on the Tri-Rail train to the Gold Coast Railroad Museum.
Mhm.
And years ago, we had an activist in the New York division who, when he resided in Florida, he was an active volunteer in the Gold Coast Railroad Museum. So we'll fondly be looking forward to that program. Please keep in mind, speaking of March, for those of you who attend the Saturday afternoon at the library programs, the second Saturday of every month at the Williamson Library in Grand Central Terminal, it will not be held in March due to the fact that the host, our own, the VP, Mike Vidiello, will be unavailable next month due to a medical procedure that he will be recovering from. So therefore, no Saturday afternoon at the movies in March. It'll hopefully be back in April. That would be April 12th. In terms of the RE Zoom meeting for April, we're going to be test running a DVD by none other than the late, great Gary Growl. And the subject matter this time would be the east end of the Long Island Railroad, everything east of Ronkonkoma and probably east of Spionk. I think that would be a pretty good description of it. And that will be a DVD, but it will be encapsulating Gary's Super 8 movies that he was the master of. So if that DVD runs through properly, that will be our April program, so stay tuned. So, and as I've made reference to tonight, we look forward to the return once again of Mr. Frank Scheer. It's always an excellent, very informative and interesting program. And tonight will be no exception because, as Frank just remarked, this program will be on the Norfolk and Western Railway depots, but it's actually a universal subject because for the most part, these stations, whatever the railroad was, all had the same purpose. And now we're going to sit back, enjoy, and set in for an excellent evening of rail fan entertainment and informative entertainment. So without any further ado, let me yield the floor to none other than Mr. Frank Scheer. Take it away, Frank.
Thank you very much, Paul. And
You're welcome.
we were talking about the format for this. If everybody stays muted unless you have a question as I go along, then unmute yourself. That way there's no background noise. And of course, at the end, there'll be, for any questions that arise and have not already been answered, there'll be an opportunity to bring those up at the end of the meeting. If people want to ask questions in the chat box, I'm not able to monitor it, but I understand that either Steve or Paul will do that. And, so they can ask your question if you don't want to come off mute and ask. So, as Paul mentioned, even though this says Norfolk and Western Railway depots, there are functions that were done by railroad station agents and telegraph operators that were identical pretty much for, all railroads. So even though you see pictures of N&W stations, that is not necessarily mean that this is the only thing that we're talking about is just the Norfolk and Western Railway. And I like that little sidebar or subtitle, if the walls could talk, because any railroad station on any railroad, ooh, if you could somehow have that talk with the stories that could probably tell. So anyway, now let me see, I advance. Let me make sure I can advance this way. So this is what we're going to talk about tonight. First of all, we'll have a little short overview, then we'll talk about the functions. Most people think about railroad stations as being passenger service. That's fine. But don't overlook freight service, railway express, Western Union, railway operations, and then in the railroad industry, we have this thing called other duties as assigned. That's almost in every job description for a railroader that I've ever seen. And this is a summary. Now, I'm not sure where this particular clerk's office is, but this is obviously a fairly large station. And posted to the Railroad Enthusiast website or sent to the members, I'm not sure which way it'll be done, is a file that has all the talking points that I'm making, plus it's the note pages for this presentation. At the bottom of the notes pages, if a station is identified and you happen to be interested in the Norfolk and Western Railway, that's where you'll find this information. I'm not going to identify depots as I go along unless I just happen to remember what it is. Because I'm not looking at the note pages, I am going directly into the presentation slides themselves. Now, the other thing is the notes pages include everything that I'm going to say. And in fact, it includes more. So you can only fit so much onto a slide and have it readable. And so I often put a lot of material into the notes pages and sometimes additional photographs. So the notes pages are really an integral part of this presentation. So moving right along, let's get into the overview. Now, in the operating rules, there's a statement for the N&W that the agent should remember that the station is a railway company and public opinion regarding the company is in the community is largely that person's responsibility. So, this is true everywhere. When you had a railroad station presence, which does not exist anymore, you had the agent there. They knew everything about what everybody was doing in town. If they got telegrams, they knew what the telegrams said, even though they were confidential. And they were sworn to confidentiality. They could not discuss any particular matters about where people were traveling, what freight they were shipping, what telegraph messages they may have sent or received, what express they received. That was all confidential. But this agent operator knew it all. And that's a very, knowledge is power. And that really put the station agent squarely in the crosshairs of knowing everything in town, being best friends with the mayor, being chummy with the postmaster, being a maybe even a bank trustee. It was all there, and it's just incredible the responsibility that a railroad station agent had. So that last line, when somebody contacted the agent, they walked up to the window, they engaged with them at the express counter, they had to treat them with courtesy and respect because it reflected upon the railroad company. Now, we of our generation expect people to treat each other with courtesy and respect, with a few exceptions, I guess. But, that's something that's sort of been lost in recent years for a lot of people and a lot of people in the younger generation. So, and this station, I can see that's uh, well, no, I guess. Oh, it's Stewart's Draft, Virginia. So anyway, in the overview, depot buildings have mostly disappeared from the railroad landscape. You don't see them anymore. It's fortunate that Boyce Railway Depot continues to exist. There are a few others that have been turned into either a museum or they've been turned into a restaurant or whatever. Railroad agencies really do not exist anywhere on any railroad now. What you have is a 1-800 number, or you log into your app, or you go online to the website of the railroad. You put in all the booking information for freight, or you order your Amtrak ticket, and get a printout with a barcode that you show the conductor. There's really no face-to-face interface with railroad station agents anymore. As a job craft, they just simply don't exist. All that carload freight has been centralized. Telegram, Express, and less than carload freight. Well, that's just a thing of the past. A lot of that really started disappearing in the 1950s, and by the 1960s, it was substantially gone. Operator responsibilities are obsolete. You don't, and we'll get into exactly what some of those operator responsibilities were, but it's, in my railroad career of 50 years ago to now, many of the jobs that I worked, not only do the stations not exist, the jobs don't exist, but the people, unfortunately, are deceased that I knew and really enjoyed working with. So anyway, very, very few people are aware of all these functions. This is the purpose of tonight's presentation. And that little place there, that is Solitude, Virginia. If you ever look at me and look at my Facebook page, I say I'm from Solitude, Virginia, which is not really true. But Solitude lives up to its name. It's got zero population. It's against the James River and some farmland. This was just a telegraph office at the west end of a passing siding, and that person was there all alone. And the way most of these agent operators traveled, if they had a change of shift, they'd be riding a passenger train, and would get off, or they get on a freight train and get off or on. So, there are no roads to Solitude. The railroad is all there is. So that's one of my favorite stations. So let's talk about what definitions are, because you got to have a starting point for every presentation and a starting point for everybody to understand what things are. A station and I'm not going to read these to you. I'll try to talk to each of the points. The station is any location that's identified in a railroad timetable. That does not mean that there's necessarily a building there called a depot or a waiting shelter. It just means that there's a place on the railroad. It's got a station name. And they are identified either in the employee timetable or a passenger timetable or in the open and prepay station list, which is a tariff. And that lists every station on every railroad. And if you're not familiar with the open and prepay station list, I'll have my contact information at the end of the presentation. You can ask more questions about that. I call the building at a station as a depot. That is where an agent resided or worked. And if there was telegraph communications for railroad operations or for a Western Union office, that's also what was there. So an agent is the railroad employee that's capable of binding the railroad to a contract. The contract that they were usually issuing most often was a bill of lading, where they were receiving goods on behalf of the railroad and arranging for transportation and determining what the charges would be. So, bill of lading is a contract. You have to have an agent perform that service. Now, an agent did more than that, but the agent could collect funds, could disperse funds. They had a lot of responsibility. And then the operator is the person who handled the telecommunications. Earlier era, that was telegraph. By the time I came along in the early 1970s working for the C&O Railway, it was telephone. But the transition from one to the other was pretty universal among all railroads. And the operator was the interface between the dispatcher and the train and engine crews, or if somebody came to the window and said they wanted to send a Western Union telegram, they were the interface between the person sending the message or wanting to send a message and the Western Union relay office to which they would forward the telegram. And this station happens to be Antietam, and not very far from where the Battle of Antietam was in Maryland. Now, some railroad stations, if they had a lot of work, a lot of activity going on, they had a clerk. Now, the clerk did not do agent's duties. The clerk took care of filing tariffs, taking care of the accounting for a station, took care of the demurrage statements and so on. You had to be a pretty active station to have a clerk assigned to it. And a very, very busy station have more than one clerk. So you don't often find clerks there. Usually, most stations, the majority of the ones in most places, they had an agent operator who performed those two roles together. A lumper, that's a sort of an unusual term for somebody who worked in the freight room where less than carload freight was handled. They are the ones who just did the backbreaking work of moving stuff off the train out of a less than carload car and moving it into the freight station. If somebody called and or arrived and wanted their freight shipment, they were the ones to go ahead and put it on a cart and put it on the wagon. So they basically did the labor in a freight house. Then you have the baggage express and mail porters. Those are the folks that you see on the platforms that were pulling carts around. They were actually pulling up against the side of the train to unload or load whatever it was, mail, express, milk. Unfortunately, they also handled the caskets of people who were deceased or were coming in that were traveling in the baggage car. Baggage express, mail porters, and the lumpers, a lot of times they were not necessarily on the railroad payroll. And at a smaller station, there was nothing really prohibiting the agent, if they didn't necessarily want to do some of that hard labor, from going ahead and paying out of their own paycheck the services for a porter or for a lumper. And see that signal there that goes way up? There's a ladder that goes up to the top. You know that there's a lantern up there for the train order signal or for the block signal. You could get a kid to go up there for a nickel, climb that ladder and bring the lamp down. And then after it's cleaned, then maybe you get them to clean it too for another 2 or 3 cents and then put it back up there. So there was lots of things that went on at stations that aren't necessarily written down. They weren't necessarily, the railroad didn't discourage it, but they also, if somebody got hit or injured, they completely disowned the situation. That was the agent's responsibility to take care of it. So this is, we'll talk about what carload freight is. That's what most people are familiar with. It's freight that's handled in an entire car. Back in the days of 40-foot box cars, the consignor, whoever was loading the car, completely filled it up, whether they had one box in there or whether they completely filled it to the roof. But that was a single shipment. Less than carload is something that disappeared by the 1950s. If you think about what, there's a lot of trucking companies now that do less than truckload freight. They've taken the market for what used to be less than carload. And that was anything that was more than, 70 pounds, that was especially things that were crated, that was handled as less than carload. And usually the situation was that the railroad, either in a local freight or a peddler train, would carry the less than carload to each station, maybe twice or 3 times a week. It wasn't necessarily a daily service. There was a schedule that the agent had and everybody on the railroad had that showed what division the train bringing the less than carload freight would arrive at a station. Transportation, that's a passenger ticket. It used to be when we were younger, and if we ever listened to some of the announcements or saw some of the signs at a major terminal, it said only passengers holding transportation are allowed through the train gates. They didn't say ticket, they said transportation. When you had transportation, you were holding a ticket. Now, so for the passenger service, the agent did lots of things. He provided the route and schedule information. Each of them had an official guide. And most of the time, I'd say probably in the majority of stations, no matter where you were, most people were traveling less than 50 miles. They just wanted a local ticket to go to the next town or maybe to the county seat. They weren't really traveling long distances. So most of this, sometimes all they had to do was look at the arrival and departures board on the side of the station, which the agent had the responsibility of keeping updated with the current planned expected arrival time. Now, they also provided rate quotes if somebody wanted to know how much something was going to cost, and like for Pullman charge, for their ticket if they were going to some offline location or somewhere else. They would have some tariffs that they could use, but for the really long distance ones, they would go ahead and send a message down to the general passenger agent's office. In this particular case, down in Roanoke, but doesn't make any difference. Any other railroad, it was going to their main office or the general office. And the general office had every tariff for every railroad that particular railroad interchanged with or made connections with, and they could determine what the rate was. Also, too, stations didn't necessarily have ticket stock that was for every conceivable possible trip that you could do. They often had card tickets for local transportation. They also had coupon tickets, which had several different coupons where you might go and make a connection within the railroad. And then, of course, if you're going interline to another railroad, then there were coupons for that connecting railroad. They would flag trains when requested. The flag signal for most railroads, if not all, was a green and white flag or a green and white light. Now, for those who like to collect lanterns and such, oh, you love that globe that's green and white. But and usually those are on presentation lanterns, but they really were not used except for any other purpose at a train order station to flag a train that was a flag stop. And then, of course, they had to maintain passenger comfort in the waiting room. Now, there's a wonderful story that I've got that the superintendent of a particular railroad, might have been the Norfolk and Western, might have been some other railroad. But back in the days of the early 20th century, there weren't very many photographs of what the superintendent looked like or what a train master looked like. And the superintendent was on a particular, stopped at a particular station, and the agent didn't recognize him. And the coal stove, this is middle of winter, and you all in Boston know what cold winters are like. He said, walked up to the window and asked the agent, well, please, please light a fire in the stove. It's cold in here. And the agent operator said to the superintendent, oh, I can't do that. I've got this big stack of telegrams. I haven't got time to mess around with that stove. The superintendent said, let me send a telegram. Give me the form. Wrote it out. Handed it to the agent operator. And it read, it was to the superintendent of stations and read, please remove agent such and such for dereliction of duty. Signed XYZ superintendent. Handed it back to that operator. He took one look at it and he read it and he said, ooh, I can't send this message. The superintendent asked, why can't you? He said, because I've got to put coal and light that fire in that damn stove. So that's your joke for tonight. I'll save you from my humor. Anyway, so carload freight. Again, just like with passenger service, the agent had to provide freight routing and schedule information upon request. Now, for most stations, it was very repetitive traffic. If there was somebody loading lumber there, they tended to load it today, tomorrow, next week, next month, you know. So once you got a freight routing and schedule information, you didn't have to go there every day and ask about that. But for a new shipper or somebody who just had something that they wanted to ship that was not a recurring shipment, they prefer a rate quote. They'd let them know what their routing options were. And for any tariffs that they had in the station, they could look it up themselves. But in many cases, especially if it was going offline to a different railroad, they would request the quotes from the general freight agent. Every railroad has a general freight agent, so you don't need to necessarily worry about Roanoke, okay? But the agent would contact the general freight agent, preferably by railroad business mail, but if it was really urgent, they would send a telegram. So they also issue bills of lading. Those are the contracts that I mentioned where you're accepting freight and specifying the charge, and you're binding the railroad to perform that service. Once the railroad takes custody of your freight as a common carrier, they are obligated to deliver it in the same condition as received. Otherwise, you have the basis for a claim. Anyway, they also collected funds and deposited the funds to a local bank or sent it to an accounting bureau that maybe was in a different city. And that happens to be Bentonville, Virginia in the picture. And I recognize this one. This is Bedford. The other thing they would do, if you wanted to load a car, you ordered equipment from the car distributor. If there was damage, you had to inspect it and prepare an inspection report. You responded to loss and damage claims that were presented by a shipper. When the car was available for loading or to be unloaded, you notified the consignee and the consignor as appropriate. And then demurrage, you may not be familiar with what demurrage is, but demurrage is when you look at the free time that the railroad allows for a car. Usually it was 48 hours to either load a car or unload a car. After the free time, the railroad was making a per diem charge for that car. And it took a lot of accounting to try to keep track of that. And the agent was responsible for collecting any demurrage for cars that were exceeded the free time. And they were also responsible for keeping track of private and blind sidings. A blind spur is a side track that goes into a facility owned by the shipper or the consignee, and the freight is loaded there. You don't see much of that today, but a lot of warehouses were that way. All the activities for freight at the depot, plus additional responsibilities for assigning non-agency stations. What I'm saying here is for the blind sidings and the private sidings, they had to do everything that we just talked about, plus they have to provide a daily report. They have to also write messages to the train crew to describe exactly how cars are supposed to be spotted and which ones are going to be picked up. Serving local industries, it was like shuffling cards. You know, some cars were picked up, some were dropped off, and some had to be moved around. So there was a lot to be done and a lot of messaging that had to be provided to the local freight crew. This is, we're talking about less than carload freight now. They were smaller shipments. You had to go ahead, and if a lot of times it was going by Railway Express unless it exceeded the dimensions and weight for Railway Express. So you had to execute a bill of lading for that as well. You had to weigh it, you had to measure it, and that was all going on to the bill of lading. As I mentioned, there was a train that would come around maybe 2 or 3 times a week. It had a peddler car in the train, and that's where less than carload freight was unloaded or loaded into during a station stop. It didn't operate every day. It had a specific schedule. And then when anything arrived, then the agent had the responsibility about sending a postal card, a notification that your freight has arrived. You got so much time before you pick it up. Just like you had demurrage for freight cars, you had free time for freight shipments that arrived that you put into the freight house. Somebody only had 48 hours to come by and pick it up without paying an additional charge. This is Buchanan, Virginia in the background, by the way. So they also release the inbound shipments to the consignee. They inspected damaged shipments, trace shipments, process claims, assess storage fee for late pickups. A lot going on. So, and this is the last part. All these things are what the freight agent had to do for less than carload freight. They accounted for and collected cash or checks, and most things were done in cash in that period of time. Most of the agents were paid in cash. You had a pay train coming around and paying the payroll. They also, if there was abandoned freight, they would transfer it back to the peddler car. It would be taken to a central location for the railroad and it'd be auctioned off. Or if there was damaged shipments and the claim was paid, they again put it into the peddler car, taken back to the central location and sold. That's where a lot of these salvage companies really got their start, handling railroad damaged freight or unclaimed freight. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, the agents could hire additional help, but is out of their own paycheck. Most lumpers, most porters, mail porters, were not paid by the railroad. They were not railroad employees. Now we talk about Railway Express. You know, that was what's important about this, aside from going through all of these things. I'm going to start more talking and less reading, I suppose. The thing about Railway Express is that it was very lucrative for an agent. They received a commission for every shipment that they received or dispatched. And so they spent a lot of time really trying to promote shipments by Railway Express, which was the whole purpose of offering it on a commission basis. And at Boyce, Virginia, they also handled what was called fancy stock, racehorses. And a single racehorse shipment, or of several horses maybe in one car, that was a very expensive freight bill of which they got a commission. Sometimes they actually earned more on the shipment of one Railway Express shipment than they did the wages that they were paid by the railroad as being an agent operator at that station. So you can imagine when railroads, station agents were looking around where they want to bid on, it made a big difference if there was a lot of good, high value Railway Express, because that was extra money for them. And sometimes better than what their wages were that they were just earning from the railroad. So anyway, they do basically for Railway Express, most of the things that I've just mentioned already are the same kinds of things that the agent and operator had to do for Railway Express. And same thing, they traced shipments, processed claims, all this stuff, just like for less than carload or for carload freight. And I think that's Dublin, Virginia in the background. But anyway, so to get their commission, they had to file a report. They had an itemized sheet that showed all the freight charges that they collected or billed. And then in turn, they got their commission from Railway Express. Now, Western Union was also commission basis. One of the reasons why Western Union had the slogan Western Union Everywhere was because they were able to have the telegraph operator handling railroad operations, as we'll talk about in a couple slides from now, also take care of telegraph and telegram traffic. Now, a station, because telegrams were very expensive, somebody might only send a telegram once or twice a year. And oftentimes it was either really good news, like somebody's about to get married, or more often it was bad news that Uncle Joe just died. But so telegrams were really not very common. And if you had to have an office in a town providing telegram service, it would be way too expensive. So having an agent operator doing this other work, and then they only earned a commission for any traffic they handled, was much more economical for Western Union and allowed Western Union to advertise that basically it had nationwide service in just about every village around the country at its at its high point anyway. So, and they were also letters that were called day letters, and they were called night letters. Day letters, the rate was higher. Night letters were deferred telegram if you got it in the daytime, but you said it was a night letter. When things were slow, they would send it, and you paid a little bit less of a charge. And that's let's see, and all those prepaid and collect message fees were received, and they had to be accounted for, and they had to be sent to a Western Union accounting office. If there were problems with the telephone or the telegraph lines, the railroads had what was called a wire chief. And a wire chief was responsible for the communications of the railroad. They had a test set, test board, usually a division office or at the headquarters. And they had the responsibility of, if there was problem, and there were often problems with these lines, these overhead lines, that had to be diagnosed. You had to figure out where they were and how to get them replaced. Now, in most cases, the agreement with the railroads was that Western Union would maintain the wires. Now, in other cases, they also did have their own pole line, and if it was that, it was across the track from where the railroad's pole line was. But the Western Union would do the maintenance for the pole line in exchange for, having their service run along the right of way of the railroad. The Western Union and railroad, there was a great relationship, because if you think about how it had to be if you were trying to string telegraph and telephone lines across private property and having to negotiate with all these different property owners, having this one right of way that goes hundreds of miles, and all you got to do is put the poles on it, that was very easy to arrange the interconnected network that bound this nation together for telecommunications. And the dots and dashes today are zeros and ones, essentially. That's what your computer is doing. So, this is Green Cove on the N&W. Great station. And you can see the Western Union sign. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but it's over here. And it says Western Union Telegraph and Cable Office. So, for railway operations, this is what the operator was primarily doing. If there was a separate operator, or if it was the agent operator, this was the half of those responsibilities that the agent operator was performing. They communicated with the train dispatcher. They communicated with the stations on either side of them if they were doing blocking. They also had to go outside when a train was about to pass, and they had to do an on-the-ground inspection of the train passing to look for fallen brake rigging, hot journals that's smoking, or whatever the case may be. That was in the era before you had hot box detectors and all this other arrangement. They copied and handled train orders and clearance cards. And if there were issues about the line, then they worked with the wire chief to diagnose where problems were. Some of the stations had what are called patch boards, where you could, it almost looks like a switchboard for a telephone company, where you put plugs in and cables, and you could reconnect some lines or go around some lines. They also, of course, serve passenger, express, or freight customer to reduce the wait time, doing all this other stuff. And they did the revenue accounting, unless there was a clerk there at the station. And this is Harrison Combination Station on the N&W. Oh, what we're doing right now is looking at priorities. Let me just back up. I need to back up that on that one. So it was important if you come up with a prioritized list. Number one for an operator was communicating with the dispatcher. So then you have the 2, 3, 4 in order of priority. You couldn't do everything all at once, so you had to have a pecking order, if you will, of things that the agent was supposed to do. And then, after several other things, then if they had to help the agent or the agent was performing these services, they go down the list. Passengers were taken care of first, then Western Union, then Express, less than carload, then carload. And then revenue accounting, if there was no clerk. Then messages or correspondence with the general office, filing tariffs, on down the list. The last one, other duties, is assigned. 13 different things that a railroad freight agent operator was supposed to do. That's a lot of work. These folks in the station were busy for the entire trick that they were performing, whether it was a day trick, night trick. They were really busy. Then they also, as the other duties is assigned, they also had a responsibility for interacting with the community, trying to drum up freight, trying to create a good public image of the railroad with the town, and any local issues that they heard about that might affect the railroad, such as, oh, we don't like that big whistle being blown for the railroad crossing. We want gates. We want a flasher. We want this or that. They had to have their ears open, and they communicated that back to the general office. And then the general office would be the one to really sort of take care of what they're going to do or not do, as the case may be. As you see, there are quite a few other duties as assigned. Okay, and that's Limetown, Virginia. If you had a message line, the railroads really discouraged sending certain kinds of messages by telegram. They didn't want to tie up the telegraph wire. So if it wasn't really so time urgent, you would type out a message and you put it in an envelope that had RRB in the upper right-hand corner where the stamp would go. It stood for railroad business. The baggage master was actually sort of like a letter carrier. He had a little tiny case in the baggage car and was sorting company mail, either to be put off at stations or to be taken down to the general office for whatever railroad it was. So there was a lot of railroad business mail of all types, but it had to pertain to railroad company business. You could not send a personal letter to somebody else. Hi, Joe, how you doing? What do you think of your new assignment? Couldn't do that with railroad business mail. You had to put a stamp on it. They also did employee training. Where do you think most of the new telegraph operators came from? Where do you think the new station agents came from? What you did is you got these kids hanging around outside your office, got the window open in the summertime. They're home from school. They hear the clatter of the telegraph sounders. They get interested. You're the one, you pay them the nickel to go up there and change the train order lamp or go out and get the switch lamp that's down at the end of the track and bring it on in to get clean. That's all in the nature of actually training future employees, future train station agents. Most of them got recruited into the railroad industry by just hanging around the station during the summer. By the time they got back into school, they sometimes knew enough that they could get a railroad job. One other short story: on the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad, they had a fellow who later was he was sort of like the signal and communications officer up in Potomac Yard. But earlier in his career, he used to work towers, used to work stations. And he was only 15 years old, starting high school. He knew telegraph. They were short of a station agent one day. they station services called or contacted the principal of the school and said, "Will you please let Herbert Jewell go home or go to work, go to the station, take care of second shift, you know?" So I don't know what the child labor law would be like today, but once you knew telegraph, um, you could write your ticket for the railroad because not that many people really did know telegraph, the Morse code. And of course, then you had to learn all these other things, operating safety rules, accounting procedures. And these are all the kinds of things that the station agent and operator, especially during the summertime, people hanging around the station, they teach them little bits of this and that. And you can figure out pretty quickly who was going to be a promising um, railroad employee and who was just having fun. I'm going to skip over this slide. If you've got the presentation notes pages, I'll let you read this. But in the course of a typical day, these are all the steps that you go through. And I'm going to leave that as a little enticement to actually have you go ahead and read the notes pages. But and then that was the morning. This is the afternoon. Individual items. One thing down here at the bottom, GN. Good night. You close the station in the morning, at night, or at the end of your trick. And in the morning, you said GM for good morning. So you open and close the station. Everything else that happened in between, there was a lot going on. And this station here in the background is Max Meadows. Let's see. Let's get going here. So, summarizing. I don't want to take all night. You all have other things to do, but I hope this has given you a glimpse that there was a lot going on for the station agent operator. It wasn't just sitting down in a chair and falling asleep and then waking up 6 hours later and then going home. And they had to be able to work around situations sometimes for which there really was little or no guidance. They just had to use their best judgment. There was an agent operator that I knew named Dennis Nauman, and he summed it up about as well as anybody I know. Implementing and fulfilling those duties required probably 100 ways and means to accomplish a complete, speedy, and accurate account. So, with that, and I want you to know that the depot buildings were multifunctional. The people worked there were multitasking. And even though the priorities were railroad operations first, that was really the main purpose of the railroad station, not just for passengers, freight. It was to take care of blocking trains, communicating with the train crews, using train orders for the dispatcher, and activities such as that, watching for defects on trains. That was really where the payroll was coming from. But they were expected to know operating rules, traffic management procedures, and communications. And as has been said before, the railroad agent was the face of the railroad to the community. That's a thing that we have now. Yeah, all these rail fans, they're all going on out. They're taking pictures of trains just going by in the countryside, nice scenery shots. You don't have that personal connection in a community with a particular railroad, no matter what railroad we're talking about. That is one of the most important things that I think has been lost in the transition to where stations were closed and agent and operators are a thing of the past. And most station agents, they stayed in a location for years. It wasn't just coming in, leaving. They really got in depth with a community, got to know everybody, and that was a big facilitator too. All agency selections for agent operators, that was all on the basis of seniority. And the seniority was based upon a particular division of the railroad, not necessarily everywhere on the railroad. So I'm concluding it with that. I don't know where this one is, but I sure like that view of looking out the window, looking for the train, and got your hand on the telegraph key. And of course, the orders and no orders signals. That's right here is very unusual, very specific to the Norfolk and Western Railway. This little cast iron sign would rotate as you move the levers. So if you want to come off mute, if you have questions, I will go one more slide. Well, wait a second. I think this is actually it. Yeah, that's it. So if you want my contact information, that's it there. It also appears in the notes pages. And so what we'll do is I'm going to stop sharing. We'll go back to a view where everybody can see each other. If you have any questions, let's talk about what station agents were and everything else that's good in life.
That was
Yeah.
fascinating. But
Yes.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
I can hear you
Yes.
loud and clear.
What is the difference between a bill of lading or a straight bill of lading and a way bill? Because I've seen modern bills of lading that look exactly like a way bill with the routing of each piece of merchandise that was being sold.
Okay. In later years, they had what was called a manifold copy. And so when you typed up the bill of lading, it also had as a second copy a freight bill. As a third copy, it had the way bill. And as a fourth copy, it had a memorandum. And then there was a fifth copy that went to the accounting bureau for the shipment. So before that, it was like 5 different forms. You had to do 5 different things in the typewriter or handwritten. So that was sort of it was an early advancement, but that's why the way bill looks a lot like the bill of lading. But you will see at the top, if it's a way bill, it'll say freight way bill. If it's the bill of lading copy that was given back to the person that's consigning the freight, that will say uniform straight bill of lading. Now, there's other kinds of way bills. You have the order bill of lading, which was a negotiable document. If you went into a railroad station and you say, I've got this order bill of lading, then you basically were showing that you had ownership of the freight that you're claiming. And that was something you could take to the bank. And people would actually transfer it from one to another by endorsements, just like a check. So that's another one. You had the Railway Express bill of lading. If you were shipping milk, there were specialized bills of lading for milk. There were specialized, actually for coal, they did not use way bills. They had what they called car tags. It showed the mine that it was being shipped from, where it was going to, and it was called a mine tag. And so lots of different ways in which all this was handled.
Yeah, well, I have I bought at a truck stop in Pennsylvania where they had a little shop where you could buy all kinds of things. It was a gift shop, but you could also buy supplies for the truck drivers. And I bought a pad of these it said straight bill of lading. And it had all the places in it where you could say what the routing of the shipment was going to be, what the item was, and when each step along the way. So I was wondering, that to me looked like what was on the old-fashioned way bill.
Yeah, you see, railroads sort of paved the way for a lot.
meeting.
And then you had a situation where wait a second. I just want to minimize my screen here. Okay. You can still see me, right?
Yes.
Oh, right. Yes, I can
Okay.
see you. Yeah.
All right. The railroads came first, really.
Of
Now they
course.
were bills of lading for canal boats. If you go way back, there's been bills of lading around. It's the contract for common carriers to arrange shipments. But so railroads got a start, and trucking companies adopted in the early days a lot of the same procedures and documentation, the layout of tariffs, the commodity classifications, and so on like that, all were derived by railroads. Railroads really paved the way for a lot of this. Now, interestingly enough, airlines did the same thing. The earliest airline schedules looked a lot just like railroad passenger schedules.
Oh, yes.
Stops all along the way. And they also developed the concept of an airline dispatcher. Now, you know that when the pilot takes off, and they're talking to the Federal Aviation Administration, the control towers for the air route traffic control or for the um, terminal, the airport traffic control. They're talking to towers. But there is actually an airline dispatcher that is keeping track of what aircraft number it is, what time it's called for. They're calling the crew for that. They are keeping track of the time of departure, the time of arrival, and so on like that. All this was modeled after how railroads did things. Now, of course, in the past 50 years, we've done a flip-flop. When Amtrak came into existence, they wanted to make everything look like airline seats and,
Yeah.
the curved cabin for the coach. Make it look like an airplane interior. So I guess everything comes full circle. But anyway, that's why that pad that you found at the truck stop, yes, a railroad bill of lading is usually a little bit longer. Those the trucking bills of lading are usually 8.5 by about 5 inches, where a railroad bill of lading is 8.5 by 11. So it's about half the size.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions?
Frank, typically the stations that were depicted in the program, what were the usual hours that they would be manned by the station agents?
Okay, in the early days, you had two tricks: day trick, night trick. And that's what you call a shift on the railroad, is a trick. Okay.
Okay.
A small station at a small town, it was a day office or a day trick only. Day in the employee timetable would specify when the starting time was and when it ended, but it was ordinarily close to 10 to 12 hours. It wasn't uncommon to have some stations 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. Now, depending upon when passenger trains were passing through there, might be a little earlier, might be a little later. The night trick was the opposite. If you had a day trick that was 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., the night trick was 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. 7 days a week.
Wow.
Unless it was specified in the employee timetable that it was, Monday through Friday or Monday through Saturday only.
Right.
When you work for the railroad, you are married to the railroad. And, you'll see cartoons. I've got a load of them that appeared in Railroad Magazine by Harry Temple. It looks like the agent operator is snoozing, in the chair. Well, if you were working 12 hours a day for 6 days straight, you'd probably want to catch a little snooze too.
Oh, yeah.
But what's amazing to me is that some of these guys, now right here, and this one here, if you could still see my screen.
Yes.
Okay, so that's the telegraph sounder. That's the
Oh,
local sounder. A telegraph operator was so used to knowing what their office call was that in Morse code, so that even if they were napping a little bit, if they heard that rhythm of that office call, they'd wake up in most cases. Now,
yeah.
sometimes they didn't, that was another problem, and I won't go into that. But you'd be surprised, you could catch a
Mm,
little nap, and even with the telegraph clattering away and doing all of this, if you heard your office call, you get back on the wire. So, uh, the best place to find out what the hours were is if you get a hold of a railroad employee timetable for the division that you're interested in, it will of a particular year. Now, as you may recall, back during the Depression, they suddenly wanted to get down to I think first they went to a 48-hour work week, and then they
yeah.
went to a 40-hour work week. When they did that, then you started getting stations that were 3 shifts a day. If it was,
Mm,
a continuous office or a tower. Um, but for a long time, the railroads, man, these people, they got a railroad job, they got steady work, good pay, but not necessarily a good lifestyle.
yeah.
Although, because they knew everything about everybody in town, they they really did pretty well in most cases. Because you see,
Mm,
if you were working in a garage or if you were working anything else in town that was hard labor, here you were just basically sitting inside of a building. Didn't make any difference whether it was rain, shine, winter, summer. You could keep warm, you could keep cool if you opened the windows.
yeah.
You stayed out of the rain. The job had its benefits aside from a steady paycheck. And these
Mm-hmm.
days, especially around Washington, D.C., steady paycheck, that may not be a certain thing for some people. So,
Yeah.
anyway, any other questions?
Thanks, Frank.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
I have an observation, if I may. Frank, I really didn't know that all this stuff went on. It's really quite fascinating, is everything that goes on.
Exactly.
People just think of a ticket agent taking, tickets and all that. And all
Mm-hmm.
these other things are really involved. It's really fascinating.
Well, and
Yes.
thank you. And that's really the purpose of this whole presentation because most people, most rail fans, they see a station building, they don't know what the freight room is for. They don't have the understanding that express handling milk, all this other stuff contributed to the revenue of a passenger train. Another thing that people typically do when they see a picture of a train, a passenger train, and they see something that looks like 6 or 8 baggage cars behind the locomotive and ahead of the passenger cars, they call them baggage cars.
Yeah,
Now, do you think
right.
on any
Yeah.
train that there's actually going to be that much baggage? No. Storage mail, express, you
Exactly.
know, that was the revenue the railroad needed to keep that passenger train operating because they weren't earning it on the passengers themselves. So, um, there's that's the whole purpose of this. This is actually a fairly challenging presentation for you to have to listen to
Mm.
because when you go into detail about all this, your eyes can glaze over. You know what the definition of an expert is? I'm waiting for
Expert.
somebody. What's
Somebody
the
who knows
definition?
everything,
Well,
everything about nothing or
a person a person who can tell you more about something than you really want to know.
Ah, yes.
So, and maybe that some of this starts getting into that, but again, look at the notes pages when you get them, and especially
Thank
that
you.
part where it's going through, in the course of a day, the different things step by step by step by step for morning, then for afternoon. It gives you a much better sense. These guys, as I said, maybe at least a couple times, they were pretty busy. It wasn't like it was a great job in some respects. When I was working on the C&O Railway, there were times that I would go to a station, I'd stay there for a week. I'd sleep in the station at night. I had canned food in the back seat of the car. I was camping out. I made money on my expense account at 75 cents a day because I didn't pay for a motel and I was eating canned food. But the point
Yeah.
is, there were times when I was just learning that it might take me, in addition to the 8-hour day, another 2 or 3 hours in the evening just to get everything done as I was learning how to do things. After a while, you start learning how to sequence things, the shortcuts you can take, the things that you can get ready for the next day so that you don't have you only have a little bit of time, but you're pre-prepared for it. By the time I left the railroad on the C&O, I could do basically an 8-hour day in 7 hours, but it wasn't much shorter than that. I did have enough time to walk up the street and get a ham sandwich and a soda. So, any other questions?
Now, you mentioned these notes. How do we get these notes that you're speaking of?
I have to let Steve and Paul answer that question. I will, if they haven't already got it, or if they can't locate it, I will send it to them. They can forward
They
it to
can
everybody
send it
else.
to you.
Now,
Good.
I think I do have it. I'm just looking in my documents in my PDF files folder, and I'm seeing just N&W-Depots RRE 2025, February
should be
28th.
it.
No, that's it. Okay, yeah. So
if
I'll
it's a
have to send that around
is it a
to,
PDF? Is it a PDF file?
yes, it is.
Okay, that should be it.
Great.
Usually, I put the word notes into the file name. So if all you do is you open it up and all you see are just the screens, just like you're seeing on the screen right now, then maybe somehow I've overlooked sending you the notes pages. But if you see the screen at the top and then you see notes at the bottom plus the name of the station that appears in that screen, then you have the notes pages.
I'll check it now. I'm seeing, yeah, it looks like it's a lot of the screens. I'm seeing just there are 31. If you include the question sheet, it's 32 pages.
Wow.
And then
Good.
and it just says the question page. And then there are 31 slides. I think this looks like what you did, just pretty much, yeah, what you did present.
But do you see at the bottom below, the slide should be small and then below it should be other words or pictures?
Yes, I'm seeing that. Yeah, right. Yes.
Okay, so you got the notes pages. So that's where you go
Very
to get the
good.
notes pages. Jim Cochran, I can send that to you directly if you don't already have it.
Oh, okay.
So,
So Steve,
Any
you'll
other
send
questions?
that out to the meeting participants.
Yeah,
Yeah.
might as well. It's easiest to send it out to everyone on the Zoom list. Otherwise, 'cause
Okay.
I think just there may have been 2 people I think who just left. I think before the just when before the question and answer started. So I don't remember
Fine.
all of them.
yeah.
Excellent.
So, but anybody else that has any questions, if it comes up or any other topics, just let me know. I'm available. Love answering these questions and certainly like to portray the history of not only the railway mail service, but all the things that I really appreciated when I was a railroad station agent myself.
Much appreciated, Frank.
All right.
Excellent job.
Excellent presentation.
Thank you very
Oh,
much.
yes.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
You're all
you.
very welcome, and
Thank
thank
you
you for
again,
your
Frank.
patience and attention.
Ah,
Thank you.
likewise. Have a great weekend.
Have a good weekend.
Yep.
Okay.
Good
Good night
weekend.
for now.
Bye.
Don't forget to turn off the recording so that you